Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Encounters, Relations with the States. In today's show, Her Excellency Karen MacDonald, Canadian High Commissioner to Trinidad and Tobago, who represents a relationship that goes back officially for some 50 years, but long before 1962, from a people-to-people perspective when Canadian missionaries settled here in 1868, bringing Christianity to indentured communities and setting up Canadian mission schools that eventually grew into the Presbyterian Church. These contacts would have created an exchange of visits and the setting up of diasporas in both Trinidad and Tobago and across the provinces of Canada, where today there are in excess of 100,000 Trinbagonians living in Canada and contributing to the socio-economic development of the country. I'm delighted to welcome to the set Her Excellency Karen MacDonald.
Good morning, Gideon.
It is always a pleasure to sit and chat with you.
Likewise.
There's so much, Excellency, that we learned of each other during the visit recently of His Excellency the Governor General, that you've been here for in excess of 3 years, and I am sure in a better position to give an assessment of your thoughts about Trinidad and Tobago. What strikes you about this country?
Well, first of all, Gideon, I'd like to say that we were delighted that the Governor General could visit in 2012, because not only is it the year in which Trinidad and Tobago is celebrating 50 years of independence, but it's a year that we are commemorating 50 years of official diplomatic relations between our two countries. Canada was one of only 3 countries to recognize Trinidad and Tobago on the very first day of its independence, on August 31st, 1962. So to have the Governor General visit during this very special year was, we thought, very opportune. One of the things that he talked about quite a bit while he was here was the obvious relationship of trust which exists between our two countries. And that trust is built on a foundation of people-to-people ties that go back, for well over 50 years to the Presbyterian missionaries that you mentioned, also to the early days of trade between our two countries when salt cod was flowing south and rum and molasses were flowing north. And so all of that has provided a very solid foundation. And when I came here over 3 years ago, it was already a very healthy, solid relationship. We had a good trade relationship. We were doing lots of training together with our police forces and our defense forces. I came here just before 2009. And in 2009, of course, Trinidad and Tobago hosted 2 very important conferences. And our Prime Minister came down for both of those with large delegations. Canada helped provide security for those events. And that was really the start to a wonderful 3+ years for me. And I think we've been able to make even more progress in those 3 years, deepening and broadening the relationship, but always with that fundamental foundation of trust and a real inclination to do business together. And when I say business, I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. We have an affinity with one another.
Yes, we share so many common things. Membership in the Commonwealth, in the United Nations, in the OAS, as you pointed out, that brought the Prime Minister to Trinidad for the Summit of the Americas. Now, how can we deepen these relations, both in terms of people-to-people contact and trade?
Well, on the trade side, we already have a thriving relationship. We do over $700 million worth of business a year together, slightly in Trinidad and Tobago's favor. We estimate that we have about $9 million worth of Canadian direct investment in Trinidad and Tobago. We, of course, are very much involved in the banking sector with RBC and Scotiabank and CIBC. We are heavily involved in the energy sector, and during my time here, we've seen some new Canadian companies enter that sector and are doing very well here. We have a number of firms that are very active in the construction and engineering sector. So that is all going well. Of course, you would know that we are in negotiations for a CARICOM Canada trade agreement, and we've completed 3 rounds of negotiation towards that agreement. We're hoping that a 4th will be initiated very soon and that we can make very quick progress on the remaining issues and hopefully sign an agreement later this year or perhaps early next. So the trade relationship is alive and well. During the Governor General's visit, we also launched a corporate social responsibility initiative where we talked about some of the contributions that those Canadian companies are making back to society. So in addition to contributing to the economy and to employment in this country, they're also doing many good works at the grassroots level. We're also investigating new opportunities for Canadian firms in the hospital sector, the health sector writ large, and in the energy sector. There's interest in our experience with oil sands development, with renewable energies, with carbon capture and storage. So alive and well, and lots of opportunity in that sector.
High Commissioner Philip Boxall is somewhat passionate about attracting to Canada the expertise of Trinbagonians who work in the energy sector. And I know that there were discussions taking place between the Minister of Labour, the High Commissioner, and officials in Alberta. Any idea where these have reached?
Well, as I understand it, the Ministry of Labour has placed advertisements in the local media for those skilled workers, and there is an arrangement with a consortium of Canadian companies in the energy sector that once there's a pool of candidates, they will come down and do the interviews and hopefully get the sorts of workers they need to really develop their industries. There is a shortage of energy workers in Canada, so it seems like a very good fit.
Yes, and we're looking also, I understand, at your technology, to bring your technology to Trinidad and Tobago in pursuit of our own initiatives in the energy sector, so that environmental issues will be minimized. Is that on the table as well?
Yes, we're very experienced in extraction of those more difficult to reach reserves, so we can bring some of that experience and expertise to the table. We also have very stringent environmental requirements in Canada that the industry has learned to live with and to respect, and so that's something else that we're very willing to share. Carbon capture and storage is another new area that Canada's been exploring for a while, and that Trinidad and Tobago is interested in.
Excellency, what is Canada's formula for its multiculturalism policy that does not marginalize the customs and traditions of the migrant population?
Canada is we often call it a wonderful experiment because we have managed to absorb those different communities. Absorb's probably the wrong word, because we welcome them, we try and integrate them into Canadian society, but we also make it easier for them to retain some of their own cultures and traditions, and the Canadian government recognizes the merit of that and provides funding and other support. So that's one of the areas that I think that we can share some of our experience, although I think Trinidad and Tobago is doing rather well in that area already. But for example, last year we did bring down an expert in multiculturalism, an academic expert, to speak at a symposium that the Ministry of Arts and Multiculturalism was organizing. And we could certainly explore that area further in the future.
And it is the question is based really on the formula for a strong multicultural policy that will not negatively impact on the cultural values of these migrant communities that have formed Trinidad and Tobago.
Correct. And what we found in Canada is that even though you're fostering and encouraging them to retain elements of their own culture, they still take great pride in being Canadian. So I think that's a wonderful balance that can be achieved.
So cultural tourism is something that we both can pursue.
I would think so. That would be a very promising area.
Indeed. Let's talk a little bit about Karen MacDonald. Your entry into the public service, your life over these years, coming to Trinidad and Tobago, and seem to be enjoying it immensely.
Yes, I've had a wonderful 3+ years here in Sweet TNT. It's been a great posting for my husband and myself. I've been in the Canadian public service for over 30 years. I did a short stint in our Secretary of State, which coincidentally handled multiculturalism at the time. And then after about 8 years there, I applied to join the Foreign Service. I'd always had an interest in international affairs. And I was fortunate enough to make the cut and to be asked to join. This is my 4th posting. I've been posted to Colombia, to Belgium, and most recently to Brazil. And all of them have been wonderful postings, all of them quite different. In Colombia, I was doing development assistance towards Colombia and Ecuador. In Belgium, I was with our delegation to NATO, so I was doing civil military affairs. And in Brazil, I was doing the more traditional diplomatic work of diplomacy and public affairs and economic affairs. This is my first posting as a head of mission, and as I said, it's been a wonderful experience.
And I would imagine that your training as a linguist would have assisted in all of these different places that you've been to and experiencing the culture of these various countries.
It's helped very much, and I think it's also important for people who are in the diplomatic service to be open to different experiences and different cultures, and everywhere that they go to just take the most that they can out of the society that they find themselves in. And here in Trinidad and Tobago, I mean, one of the first things that struck me about it was how welcoming a society it was, and particularly towards Canadians, because of those people-to-people ties that exist and have existed for hundreds of years. So that makes it a very easy place to do business. The other thing I love about Trinidad and Tobago is your love of culture. Culture and music and calypso and carnival and the various festivals associated with the different ethnic groups. It's a fascinating place to be.
As I was listening to that remarkable extemporaneous presentation, I just jotted down a few lines of my own that can't compare, but let me try at least to reciprocate. You teach us to sing with joyful hearts, you compose with special smarts, and celebrate TNT culture and the arts. We can't take that to the Royal Bank, but it stands in first-class rank. Thank you very much.
Did you get a chance to play Mass?
I've played Juvet. I haven't yet played the full Mass.
And do you plan to before you leave?
If I'm still here for next Carnival, that's definitely an option.
And your entry into the diplomatic service, was this by choice or opportunity?
It was by choice. In Canada, anyone who has a degree from a university can write the annual exam that's held. And some 3,000 people wrote it the year that I wrote it. And then they sort of narrow down the field with interviews and reference checks and so on. So I was one of the lucky 60 or so that was taken in that year.
Excellency, climate change is a major issue that affects all countries of the world, particularly vulnerable small island developing nations like ours, and I'm sure that we would be looking towards Canada for assistance in various forms, one of which would be to consider the issue of migration, not as environmental refugees, but people who are trying to leave small island nations like ours and go to safer ground like Canada. How is Canada dealing with those issues?
Well, we are giving quite a lot of assistance to the international community in the area of adaptation and mitigation for climate change. And we have put aside specific amounts of money for small island developing states. One of CEDA's main areas of endeavor here in the Caribbean is disaster management preparedness. Disaster preparedness and management. So we're giving quite a lot of support in that area as well. The High Commission itself has been helping an organization called Habitat for Humanity here in Trinidad and Tobago. One of their projects, recent projects, was to make homes that were already built better prepared to withstand a natural disaster, better roofs and things like that. So we're doing a number of things in that area. The topic of migration is always a tricky one. Canada, of course, welcomes almost 300,000 immigrants a year, and we continue to do that. It's important for our economy. But on the other hand, we realize that especially small nations don't want to lose their best and their brightest. And so it's a delicate balance that you have to achieve. In fact, we recently modified our scholarship programs because we were a little bit concerned that we were contributing to that brain drain. If we offered a 4 or 5 year scholarship, we might find that the young woman or the young man developed ties in Canada, found a job, and stayed after the scholarship ended. So we're now focusing on shorter term scholarships, usually less than a year, and the student would normally remain a student of his or her home institution and go up to Canada to do 1 semester or 2. And hopefully in that way they're getting the benefit of the Canadian education system, the benefit of the experience of studying abroad, but then they're coming back home to apply their knowledge and experience to the benefit of their compatriots.
Yes, I remembered a few years ago, under a different administration, there was a problem where Trinbagonians were applying for refugee status in Canada, and there was a member of the opposition in the parliament, Jim Karigianis, who came to Trinidad and found himself in a lot of difficulty, and had to go back and apologize to the Canadian Parliament because of the role that he played. So I fully understand what you're talking about. How is Canada bracing for what appears in the minds of the economic pundits to be another possible recession?
Well, Canada weathered the last one relatively better than most countries. Amongst the OECD countries, it was the last to enter a full-fledged recession and the first to come out. And I think that a large part of that has to do with the nature of our banking system and the controls that are on the banking system. It's quite a cautious system, which Canadians used to complain about, but now they're finding maybe it wasn't quite so bad. But we did manage to come out of it not unscathed, but relatively well off. The government's been, since that time, has been priming the economy. There's been a number of major incentive programs to get the country back on track, and I'm fairly confident that that will hold us in pretty good stead for the future. I think it's also interesting that Trinidad and Tobago, although touched by the last crisis, also weathered it a little bit better than some of its neighbours, and whether that's due to the presence of the Canadian banks in your financial sector or other factors, I think you still have a strong economy that can withstand some of the bumps along the road.
Yes, I want to bring this discussion to a close, revisiting the time spent in Trinidad by your Governor General. I remembered your Prime Minister, in describing him, says that he represents the best of Canada, very affable man who wrote an extempo song, yes, but didn't sing it. Cultured in terms of his academia, a professor of law, who has had a lot of interactions with Trinbagonian students who've studied at McGill and the University of Waterloo and so on, where he taught. What are some of the other deliverables of that visit to Trinidad and Tobago? Because, as you would appreciate, when these visits take place, the people on the ground are always asking for benefits.
Yes. Well, we actually did have quite a number of deliverables, and I'll get to them in a moment. But just to go back to your point about the nature of the man and his wife, incidentally, when he became Governor General, he adopted a motto of sorts, and it was a smart but caring nation. And I find that really fits the man as well. He's an extremely intelligent man, but he's also a very caring man, very down-to-earth, very people-oriented. And I think that shone through during his time here. But back to the deliverables, we signed 2 agreements while he was here. We signed a technical framework arrangement in the health sector, and that's going to facilitate not only our involvement in some of the new hospital projects that are taking place here in Trinidad and Tobago, but also broader cooperation in the health sector, training and exchanges. One of the members of his delegation was the CEO of the Hospital for Sick Children, and I think there's definitely some work that we can do together in that area. In fact, that organization is exploring the possibility of establishing a pediatric oncology initiative here in the Caribbean, and Ms. Haddad's presence on the Governor General's visit gave some impetus to that. The other agreement that we signed was an MOU on cooperation in the corrections area, so between Correctional Services Canada and your prison service. And that's a relatively new area for us. We're very, very strong in the security sector here. I would venture to say one of your strongest partners. We've been training police and defense forces for years. We had a visit of the first ever visit of the Canadian Chief of Defence Staff late last year, and that was followed by a technical visit to see what more we could do in that area. But corrections was one we hadn't been too involved with in the past, so that's opening up an exciting new area to complement the other things that we're doing. We often say we're now in cops, courts, and corrections. Courts, we have a major criminal justice reform project going on here with the Criminal Justice Advisor from the UK that Canada is funding. There were also several announcements made of Canadian support during the Governor-General's visit, totaling about 5 million Canadian dollars. About 3 million, a little more than 3 million of that went to CAREC, the Caribbean Epidemiology Center, and that was for a biological hazards lab and sample kits, very important these days in combating infectious disease. And the rest of the $5 million was going to projects that are being run by the UNODC and the Organization of American States, and focusing on combating illicit drug trafficking and organized crime. So 2 agreements, several announcements of funding. We launched our CSR initiative, as I mentioned. On the Governor-General's delegation, there were 2 representatives of agencies that are beginning major new projects here. One is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and their project is called CARE-LED, and it has 2 main thrusts. One is to strengthen local government, and one is to promote growth of SMEs. So that's a $20 million Canadian dollar project for the region over the next 5 or 6 years. And it was announced during the Governor-General's visit that that project would be headquartered here in Trinidad and Tobago. We were taking up an offer by your government, which was much appreciated. And the other organization was the Association of Canadian Community Colleges. And it also has a project just beginning, also over 20 million Canadian dollars, called Education for Employment. And it's focusing on technical and vocational training, which is a good complement to some of the other academic linkages that exist between our 2 countries. And we talked with the Prime Minister, the Governor-General talked with the Prime Minister about Trinidad potentially joining Brazil and Canada in a project called Mulheres 1000, or 1,000 Women. And that is a project that is designed to lift women out of poverty by giving them job skills training. And the Prime Minister expressed great interest in that, so it's our hope that in the next few months we'll be able to work out the details of how Trinidad and Tobago might also be able to participate in that very worthwhile project.
I'm not surprised that the Prime Minister has expressed that kind of interest, because it's one of her pet subjects.
Absolutely. And I think she was also very interested in the Hospital for Sick Children's initiative.
Yes, indeed. One can only imagine if the Governor-General and his delegation had stayed here for 2 weeks, what would have happened, what the bag would have contained, Your Excellency.
Yes, it was very, very fruitful. And one area I haven't mentioned but sort of underlaid the whole visit was education. Education, 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 as he said a few times. And the High Commission has been working very hard over the past few years to increase the linkages between our tertiary education institutions. University of the West Indies has, I think, almost 20 cooperative arrangements with Canadian institutions. UTT and COSTAT, not so many. We've been trying to work with them to encourage that sort of arrangement. And I think we identified some promising new linkages in that area as well. And of course, education is so key. Academic linkages are so key in fostering those other areas of endeavor, whether it be trade or security or investment, what have you.
It is fascinating a story, Excellency. Cod coming from Canada this way, rum and molasses going up north, and in between all of these years, so much has taken place. I thank you very much for this opportunity to chat with you and to be our guest on Diplomatic Encounters.
My pleasure, Gideon.